So hi, I'm Jess Collicott. I'm a solution consultant here with Deliveron. Today in the Lunch and Learn, kind of go through something that caught my interest here a few weeks ago, going through some learning on how to browse the web securely. One of the things that I discovered on lynda.com was how to set up a free open source VPN server and do it pretty quickly. And so I wanted to step through that, setting up that VPN server on Azure. And I primarily wanted to do that so when I'm traveling at clients or in airports or coffee shops, I wanted to make sure that I knew where my internet traffic was coming in and out of, and that I wasn't being intercepted by somebody who had malicious intent on that hotspot. So let's go ahead and go through those steps. I'll walk through a guide with heavy credit to Scott Simpson, who did the original tutorial on lynda.com. But one of the amazing things that I discovered was if you have an Omaha Public Library card, you can get access to lynda.com for free. You don't have to pay the $25 or $30 monthly charge and get access to everything. So I just was going to show that real quick. And so let me bring up my browser here. So if you go to the Omaha Public Library, and I know it's not just for Omaha, other states have access too. But if you go to the Omaha Public Library and go to online learning resources, they have a list of different things you could take advantage of. And then here is listed lynda.com. And it has this little sign, which means you need to have your library card. And then you also need a PIN on your library card, which I think you have to go in maybe to the library to set. But then once you have that, you get access to all these things. You can download free MP3s through having a library card and things like that too. So kind of interesting.
So many perks.
Yeah, I know.
Library
has nothing to do with books.
Yeah.
What am I doing this weekend?
Yes. So with your library card, you get kind of a specialized login to lynda.com. And so I have an account here. I'm not, to my knowledge, paying for anything. And just using my library card to get in here, have access to all of the different things that are available on lynda.com, which is part of LinkedIn Learning now. So that's kind of cool. This particular path that I got on, I was going through this series by Scott Simpson called Browsing the Web Securely. And in there he talks about VPNs, which I'm generally familiar with, but then one of the parts of his session was actually installing and using Algo VPN server, which I'd never heard before, but is a free open source VPN server that has been specifically created to be easy to use to set up and almost near disposable in my mind as needed. But great steps. I do want to give him credit in this video, and then I did give him credit through Twitter, tagged him, and he replied saying that he was glad to hear it was all working out great. So thanks, Scott Simpson. Follow him, go through his sessions, easy to follow. Okay, so switching back over really quick here, wanted to just talk about why did I want a VPN on Azure. So one, when traveling and I'm thinking about either being in airports or coffee shops or something like that, I don't currently have a VPN service. And so when I choose to connect, I know I'm risking a little bit there doing that as far as traffic going back and forth. And so that was one of the drivers. Second, because of our Microsoft MSDN account, currently I have free credits that I could use to kind of play with and not incur any hard cost. So basically get it for free, if you will, from a hard dollar perspective. And then just to be clear, what I'm not looking for is I'm not performing any criminal activity. I'm not looking to be anonymous. This solution won't work for you if you're looking to do either of those things. So FYI, for those of you who are engaged for those reasons. And so we can continue on, but just know that if you follow this, don't do anything bad because you can be tracked back to who you are. All right, so to get to the information about Algo VPN, it is actually hosted on github.com. Underneath Trail of Bits helps provide the development coordination for Algo. So if you go on to the GitHub page, there's quite a bit of information there, but it kind of talks through some of the features and anti-features. So from a feature perspective, and I'm not as strong on some of the cryptography as maybe I used to be, but it supports modern strong encryption. It will auto create profiles to bring into iOS and macOS. If you want to use it, and I haven't actually tested it, apparently it will set up DNS in a way that it will block ads through the VPN service. I haven't tested that. And then a couple other things, and it can auto-deploy to a number of cloud services, including DigitalOcean, Amazon, Azure, but we're going to go through the manual steps of creating these, so setting up your own Ubuntu server. In theory, actually, you could deploy this if you had a static IP at home on your home network, so all your traffic came through your home network, if that made sense. But we're going to set up in Azure today. Some of the anti-features, I think, are both meant to be positive as well as just mostly FYI. So it doesn't support some of the older Cypher suites, so you don't have to worry about some of those concerns. There's no dependency on TLS. It does not install Tor, OpenVPN, or what it considers other risky servers. Does not require client software on most platforms. I didn't have a chance to go through Android. I think Android does require a free client to get the VPN up and going, but we can step through that. And then as it calls out here, does not claim to provide anonymity. And basically these little letters here mean that it doesn't protect you from the government. So just know that. Okay. So those are some of the benefits and things to keep in mind when going and looking at Algo VPN to set this up. And so what I think makes sense now is maybe transitioning to start going through the setup. So for the setup, I went through and we'll have in these steps go through the process of setting up an Ubuntu VM on Azure to be our server for the VPN, and then we'll go through kind of setting up some of the ports and things that we need to open up there, and then we'll step through the process for installing Algo VPN. So in these steps, I'm going to assume that you already have an Azure account, and specifically for those of us that deliver on that, you have an account set up with your MSDN credits, so you don't have any hard costs. So I'm going to go through kind of setting that up right now. So I'm going to go ahead and create a resource group to host the container in. And so I've already got one set up here with my existing Algo VPN, but I'm going to go ahead and create a new resource group. And so there's a couple of cloud engineers who are present who might heckle me on our standard convention for naming resource groups.
Absolutely not.
But I'm going to call mine demo VPN-algo, and this is just a name. There's nothing really that drives this from a functional perspective. And then I'm going to go ahead and put this resource group in Central US. You do have a number of regions. Now you can provide the region at the VM level as well. So go ahead and create. Okay, so now we have our resource group, which is kind of our logical container for what we're going to set up here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new VM. So I'm going to go to our resource group, click Add, and I'll come up to the Azure Marketplace. I'll do a search for Ubuntu. And I do see it listed there, but I'm just going to go ahead and show the search results. So because it's the most current long-term support, which is what LTS stands for, I'm going to select 18.04. And long-term support means it'll be supported for a number of years. The deployment model is Resource Manager, which is the more current version of deployment. And so we'll click Create. And then we start to go through some settings here that I'll kind of guide you through as I step through it. So the resource group, we want to select that resource group that we just created. Again, that's kind of a logical container. Here's where you're going to create a name for that virtual server. So I'm going to call mine Demo Algo Server. And we'll actually reference it from an IP address later, so the name isn't terribly important. But this is how you'll reference it later. Then here's where you select the region. Now, in theory, and I haven't tested this myself, but you could create your own VPN, say, for instance, in Japan. If Matt Sierra is trying to access manga in Japan that's locked down from US, in theory, he should be able to do that. Now, I haven't tested that, but that's something to keep in mind when creating your region is kind of getting around some of those regional things that kind of lock you down. So I'm going to create mine in the Central US just because that's where I'm at, and I'm not really concerned about that. We already have the image using the Ubuntu, so Azure will set up the Ubuntu image for us. The size, I don't have a ton of guidance on this. I think any range of size, even this B1S, the smaller one, will work fine. I've used the B1MS just because it seems a little newer, and I don't really understand all the details, to be honest, but it seems that if it's underutilized for a period of time, once you start to use it, there'll be a little burst of performance. So because I know that my VPN server, I'm not going to use it all the time, I know in some way I'm storing up a little performance credit there, so when I do use it, hopefully it's supposed to be a little bit faster. I know that in comparison, I've seen a lot of people use DigitalOcean, and they'll use a $5 VM. So it seems like you can get away with this pretty cheaply. So I'm going to select the B1MS size. And so we can see that we have one virtual CPU, 2 gig of memory, don't need a lot there. And then from the administrator account, we're not going to use an SSH public key. We're going to use a password. And so go ahead and create a username. For instance, I'll just use my name here at this point. And then assign a password, and you'll use this password to connect to the server later. And it needs to pass the complexity requirements from Azure. So this username and password is what we'll use to connect into the Linux machine once it's set up. You can leave Active Directory off. We're not using Active Directory. We're connecting directly. And then for allowed selected ports, we're going to allow several ports, but initially all we really care about is SSH. So enable SSH port and click Next. Here you have the opportunity to choose your disk type. You could just click through and click premium SSDs. I don't know if there's really any difference. I go ahead and click standard because I don't feel like I need premium, but physical hard drives are so old school, so I'm still using the solid state. No good rhyme or reason there. Then let's go ahead and click into networking. And so a lot of these defaults you can take and be fine. Make sure that SSH is allowed as a selected port. There is one thing here that I think is probably worth investigating depending on your need. So this VM does not support accelerated networking, which I believe would provide higher throughput for internet connection. In my personal use, or at least what I've been using Algo VPN for, I'm not as concerned about speed. So I did a speed test even last night on an example VM I set up with the same configuration. Download was 6 megabits per second. Interestingly, upload was about 150 megabits per second. So there's some difference there. I don't know if anybody knows how to get that checkbox to light up for accelerated networking.
VM support it.
Okay.
I believe, and then same with your SSD as well. Like if, when you created the VM, it created all those filters at the top for you automatically, which is why you only saw about 15 VM options. You could actually uncheck the filter, and there's like 50 of them.
Okay.
And so if you're not going to use premium, you can actually get a cheaper VM option as well.
Cool. So there's more cost-effective ways to do this. I'm assuming that accelerated network probably requires a little bit more expensive.
It will be, yeah.
Yeah. That was my assumption. That's why I didn't pursue it too much. But that's something that you could look into if you're concerned about having high throughput for your VPN usage. So go ahead and click Next into Management. One thing, at least in my opinion, you'll want to turn off here is this auto shutdown. If you don't turn off auto shutdown and just take the defaults, for instance, every day at 7 p.m. Central, that VM will shut down and then I'll have to manually restart it. So I'd recommend turning off auto shutdown. And then
There's a caveat there.
Yes.
In this scenario, of course, you're doing a cost-effective VM, right? So you
Sure.
do want to shut it down, right? But if for whatever reason you did decide to go with the higher price tier VM for the accelerated network or premium store, something else, right? That's a more expensive VM. You might want to be a little bit more cognizant of how long your VM is running, right? You're not burning cache.
That's a good point.
You could also auto start it in the mornings. So if you only wanted to have it on, you could shut it off for half the day. So you could always have it auto shut off and auto turn on.
Cool. Yeah, so there's options there, and it crossed my mind, if I knew I wasn't traveling for a period of time, I could just shut the VM off. For now, I just have it running because I have enough credit. So there's obviously different ways to handle that, so appreciate the input on that. So then let's go ahead and create that VM. Click next through the next several options. Gives you a quick summary of the settings that you chose. Go ahead and click create. So this will take just a couple minutes to get through, and it'll give you a status up here in the upper right. One of the things that makes sense at this point that I thought from a procedure standpoint was to download and install PuTTY to be able to connect to the VM. You wouldn't have to use PuTTY, but PuTTY's free. I believe it's open source, and so to be able to download and use that. So PuTTY is very common and used in the Linux world. So you can go to putty.org, download that client. You can download either 32-bit or 64-bit, and then install that. I already have it installed here, so it's a very small-looking utility that uses that you're used basically to provide just a remote shell. If you have the Linux shell installed on your Windows 10 VM, which I do have, you could use that instead. The VM has been created. We have Ubuntu. Hopefully you've installed and downloaded and installed PuTTY so that we can connect to the server here in a little bit. So one of the things that we want to do is open up a couple more ports for the VM so that the VPN connection can go through. So I'm going to connect or select that VM, which I can either do through this screen, or I could go to the virtual machines over here on the left and connect that way. So here you can see some of the basics around the virtual machine, see some performance, public IP address, which will be important. We'll come back to that. But for now, let's go to networking. And this shows us the ports that are open. So Azure will close by default, basically kind of hard firewall a lot of ports to that VM to make it more secure. We need to open up a couple just to be able to allow traffic through. So for the first one, the source is any. The source port range can be any as well. The destination port that we want to use is 500. Any protocol. And then we can leave the priority at 310, and then you might just change the name instead of port 8080 to port 500 so that that's more clear. And then one more rule that we need to add is for port 4500. So we'll change that port here to 4500. The last one was 500. Again, any protocol, any action, priority, we need to change just slightly because it'll conflict with the last one. We'll change that to 4500. Click add. So that will allow our connections to make it through to the VM once we have it set up. So the next thing that we want to do is connect to the VM. And so what we need is the public IP address, and you'll want to copy this off somewhere because we'll use it several times. So I think I have Notepad here. So I'm going to paste that IP address, and then if we go into PuTTY, we want to set up a new session. So connect to that server. I'll set up the host name as the IP address. You could then save the session if you wanted to, but I'll go ahead and click connect. Make sure you're set up for SSH using port 22. It'll say, hey, I've never seen this server before. I don't know the host key. Are you okay with connecting? I'm going to say yes. And then this login is going to be the username and password that you set up when we were creating the VM through the Azure portal. So for me, the username was Jess. I'll put in my password. And now we're in the VM, the Ubuntu virtual machine that we set up through Azure. So for myself, one of the things I like to do is just to make sure that everything is up to date and good to go. And so I'm going to kind of do that. The equivalent is kind of going into Windows 10 and saying, hey, check for updates, and then install cumulative updates or whatever those are. So I'm going to go ahead and type those things in. So I'm going to say sudo, which is a way to say run basically an administrator command, apt get update. That'll basically go out and check and say, hey, what updates are available? Again, this is kind of like saying on Windows 10, check for updates. And then I'm going to say sudo or type sudo apt get upgrade. which will go ahead and apply those updates. So it looks like Microsoft has a new image, which is fairly up to date, so no updates there. One of the things I'm going to do, just to kind of show you, if you do have the Linux shell on your Windows 10 machine, that it's actually a little easier and you don't need a third-party software to connect. So I'm going to log out of PuTTY and close that. And then I'm just going to say SSH, the IP address, and it'll say the same thing. I've never seen this survey before. Then I input the password, and I'm connected kind of out of the box here using the default shell provided through the Windows Store. Okay, so now that we have that set up, and we've already captured the IP address of our server, let's go ahead and install the Algo VPN. So to do that, one of the first steps, and the GitHub page has steps on how to go through this install. The first one talks about setting up on a cloud hosting provider. We don't need to do that because we've already set up the VM. To download Algo, we can leverage some of the Git capabilities rather than having to manually download it and extract it. So we'll go back up to the repo here where it says clone or download. We'll copy that URL. And then in our shell, we'll type the commands git clone and then paste in the URL. So that will leverage Git to go ahead and clone that repo. Then we'll go into the Algo directory, do a quick ls-l to see what's out there, and we can see that the files are present. Okay, so the first step that we then want to go through is installing the Linux dependencies for Algo. So this is really nice. The Algo team has made this pretty easy with this step 3. If you go to Linux and just copy everything that you see here except for the $, which represents the prompt, paste that in, hit enter. That will go ahead and install that batch of dependencies. This will take just about a minute to run, and then we'll install a couple more dependencies. So once that completes, then we'll move on here to step 4. So we can go ahead and copy these Python scripts, and this step will take less time than this current step, but be ready to connect here in a second. What this Algo setup will do is install the server, but also create the VPN configuration files that you'll need to be able to set up, for instance, your Mac OS, your Windows 10, your Android devices. And it's, again, as I mentioned, they've tried to make it, obviously it's a little techy, a little geeky, go through this process, but in general, try to make it pretty easy to set up and install, what is a free open source VPN server. So we'll let this finish here real quick. Okay, now that that's finished, we'll go ahead and paste in the commands from that step 4 on the GitHub page. So that will set up those things. And then the next step that we'll go through is set up a username in the config file and kind of change a couple of the defaults.
Progress indicators are nice.
Yeah, isn't that nice?
Providing value, though.
Yes.
So
It's not moving.
That's what things are at.
Okay, so that was a little shorter. Okay, so let's edit the config file. So we're going to use nano, which is one of the basic editors in Linux. So nano config.cfg. And then what you'll see up here at the top is just kind of basic sample usernames. We're going to delete users that we don't need and then add the user or users that we do want to add. So I'm just going to delete the Dan and Jack, put Jess instead, hit Control-X to save, and then Control let's see, and then exit out. And then we're good to go ahead and start the deployment. So I'm going to type /algo, which will start the setup process, and it will ask us several questions. So the first question that we have here, let me move this over a bit, is which cloud provider do we want to use this for? So apparently there is some automation in some of these things. Again, because we installed our own and we're actually on the server, we're going to choose 9. So install existing server. So I'm going to choose 9 for existing server. Then it asks, do you want to set up VPN on demand? So the first time I went through this process, I said yes. What that does then is when you move over the configuration files to your iPhone or your Mac OS, every time you connect to a network, it will automatically connect to a VPN. That's not what I want because I'm good with my networks and things, and I want to be able to manually set that. So I choose no. I don't want to enable VPN on demand. That is something that you can control through your iPhone or other device. And then it'll ask about Wi-Fi. I say no, VPN on demand. Here it asks, do you want to have block ads while surfing? I haven't used that. Feel free to try it. For this specific case, I'm going to say no, just because I don't want it to mess up any of my sites. And then for this question, do you want to have each user have their own account for SSH tunneling? Because I'm just installing it for myself. There's really just one user. I'm going to say no. Then we have the question, do you want the VPN to support Windows 10 or Linux desktops? It talks about this being less secure if you enable it, but I do want to have the VPN option on my laptop just in case I'm at Starbucks or Scooters or some other place and there's wireless. So I'm going to say yes. And then it asks, do you want to retain basically the root certificate authority key to be able to add users in the future? I'm going to say no. Once you've gone through this process, it is fairly simple to go back through it again. So if I ever wanted to redo it, I'll just create a new VPN server. And then I think it goes through several things on setup, and then it will ask us for an IP address. Since we're on the server itself, we're going to say localhost. And then it'll ask for the public IP address of your server, and this is used to create the certificates and some of the connection settings. So from your Azure portal, copy and paste over the VPN or the public IP that was given to you. And then it's going to go through the installation. We'll come back to this in a second, but we'll need to be able to grab some files from the server. So one of the ways that you can do that, again, if you don't have things set up for Linux natively on your Windows 10 device, is I would recommend installing FileZilla. So FileZilla is an FTP client. It's free. You can download it for multiple platforms. It does support SFTP over SSH. So go ahead and download that client. And I have it already installed here and use it for a number of things already. So once the VM is set up here, actually we could go ahead and do that while we're waiting. So let's go ahead and click New Connection. So we'll put in the IP address for the host. And this is left over from prior, so I'm going to change the IP address to this new one I'm setting up here. Change the protocol to SFTP with SSH. The port is 22. And then use the same username and password you set up when you created the VM. Click Connect. You can see the status up here, and we're actually VPN or FTP'd into that machine. So while that's still going, I'm going to go ahead and go into the Algo directory. You can see I'm starting in my home. I'm going to go to Configs. And then once this setup finishes, there'll be a folder in here based on the IP address of the server that we'll want to grab several files from.
Have you had this in any of your trials, had the VM set up for an extended period of time?
Yeah, the one I've got configured on my iPhone and this laptop right now has been up for several weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you run into any issues with IP address changes on your VM?
Nope. I've not.
That's pretty nice.
Yeah.
I wonder if in the event, because those IP addresses I don't think are static.
Okay.
And so I'm just wondering what that reconfiguration process may look like.
Sure.
Which, if you have to do it every other day, it might be
Right.
a little bit brutal.
Too annoying. Yeah.
But if it's, potentially once a month or every few months, right? Because you are leaving it on. I
Yes.
think that might be one of the catches here, right? Is that you're
Okay.
leaving it on. But just wonder what that reconfiguration process looks like.
Yeah, I would
But you
guess.
said it's not that difficult, right? Once you go through it, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. I would guess you'd have to recreate all the files that it's generating here if the IP address changed, because the certificates are tied to the IP address. So you can see it's creating those public keys and everything. Okay, so now that it's finished, a couple things. If you notice on the screen, it says the SSH key password for new users, and it gives you an auto-generated password. You want to copy that out because you'll need that to configure your VPN connections. I would recommend storing that in a safe place. I'm going to end up throwing away this VM, so I'm just going to put it on Notepad here and hope I don't close it in the meantime. So we'll go back onto the FTP here, and you can see now there's a folder that has the IP address of the server. This has all of your configuration files to be able to use by your devices. So let's go ahead and download this folder, which hopefully will take just a tiny bit. And then if you browse to that folder, there we go. Let me go this way. For instance, for iOS, the only file that you really need is this mobile config file, which hopefully has the username that you configured with at the beginning. If you're able to get that on your phone, and I'm not saying this is the most secure method, but I can email that to myself through the native mail client on iOS. Click that file. It'll bring up some prompts that I have screenshots of here. So for example, if I were to email that to myself, you would see a screen that should show the IP address of the server. It would say, hey, do you want to install this VPN profile? You click install. Then it'll ask you for the passcode, and that passcode is what was just given to us by that server. So that's where you would need this passcode that was created after Algo was set up. Then you would ask you, are you sure you want to install the certificate? It's not trusted. I'm going to say yes because I'm aware of how it was created and I trust it. So I click install in the upper right. Then it would say it's installed. You could say done. And then if you go into your VPN settings, you would see a new VPN for that Algo VPN with the IP address. Now, my understanding of the differences with, let's see, let me go back to the Algo site here, is that Android is a little bit different. And if you go to the site, it talks about installing on Android devices. So apparently you need the WireGuard VPN client, which appears to be free. And then it tells you the conf file, the config file that you need to use. And it even has, I was noticing this last night as I was getting ready. If you go in there, it has a QR code that apparently you can use with the Android app to just configure it and get that going, which is kind of interesting. I don't have an Android phone, so I couldn't go through those steps, but that's there. And then to get your server set up on Windows 10, as long as you click yes, it creates this PowerShell for you script and it includes the needed files. You can go through all the steps manually, or you can just run that PowerShell script. So if you were going to do that, you can just search for PowerShell, right-click, run as administrator, go to that directory, And then what you would want to run is, let me check my settings here. PowerShell, execution, depending on how you have your execution policy set up, policy, bypass. So for this once, we're going to bypass the execution policy if you have it set up to be restricted or a different setting. And then file, and then the specific file here that we have, PS1 just let's see, what is the file name? Windows. So Windows underscore yes.ps1 and then add. So hopefully that's legible, and that is on the instructions here to actually do that as well. If you run that script, it'll run through actually installing the VPN, so that once you're finished and you go to VPN settings, you now have a VPN listed there. So to test that, if I just type in what is my IP address, without connecting, here's the current IP address of where we're coming from. Hopefully this doesn't drop our current web conferencing system. Okay, so kind of as expected, when I connected to the VPN, came in as a different IP address. Skype for Business, which is what we're using to record this, dropped. But you can see that the IP address changed. So now I'm coming in. All my traffic is going out on that VM on Azure that I set up and coming back through that VM. So it's no longer directly going through our ISP here out through the internet. So once you have your iPhone set up, it's really easy. You just click VPN Connect. It's almost as simple. And now I know that all my traffic is going out through that Azure VM. Kind of a bonus, one thing that you could do at this point, if you don't have a need to come back into your VM for a period of time, just to keep it more secure, is to go back into your networking settings on that VM, and you could delete the SSH port so that nobody can try to hack logging into your VM, and that would keep it a little bit more secure. Thanks, Matt, for that. So that is an option that you could do, and then just re-enable that SSH port whenever you wanted to actually remotely connect back into that VPN or into that server. Okay. That's kind of, and that took longer than I thought, but in my mind, it was kind of simple to go through. Yeah. Okay.
Good job.
So are there any advantages of setting up your own, or what are the advantages of setting up your own versus going with one that's out there and available?
Yeah, I think, and I don't have a lot of experience, I do think some of the VPN services that you can pay for probably are more cheaper than running, for instance, this B1MS server. But knowing that I have Azure credits, it's essentially free for me to be able to run this. And then two, I think there's still some questions on, what are you really intermixing your traffic with on some of those? Some people are coming out through your machine doing maybe questionable things. It depends on how those VPNs work. So if you're somebody who wants to know how your traffic is being used and where it's going and coming out of, setting up your own server, it's coming out of this server on Azure. It's not being intermixed with any illegal activity that may pop on the radar or anything like that. So I'm not a VPN expert on a lot of these external services, but those are some of the things that came to mind for me.
So I do pay for an external VPN service.
Okay.
And some of the features that particularly draw me to paying for my service is the anonymous aspect of surfing the internet. There was also a period in time where I was actually really into configuring VPNs and having that private browsing experience, right? And so there is a way through using OpenVPN to configure a VPN on your, for example, router at home. And so I was able to target certain machines on my network that, those IP addresses go through the VPN tunnel and other devices on my network do not, right? So there's a lot more control that I had over my home network, and it was pretty cool. But so you do get a couple extra features and a little bit more customized experience, I suppose you could say. But I think for 99% of us, right? Like having a simple VPN set up like this is what you're after. Just making sure that when you're at Starbucks and you log into your bank account, you're not worried about somebody spoofing, the access point, playing a man-in-the-middle attack on you and capturing your credentials or something along those lines. So this is very cool.
Yeah. So it's good to have Matt here.
Yes. We're glad you're here.
Cool. Any other questions? All right.
That was cool.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody.